couple minutes for
Okay.
For everyone else.
Hello, everyone. We're already recording this session. So want to say hello to Bernice, Minat, Lou, Roberto, Rochelle, and Sam.
Hi, goodbye. I'll be back in a few minutes.
Okay, no problem. And Frida.
Hello.
So I'm going to start in about another minute. Usually people come in right at the last second, so I'm going to wait another minute or so, and then we'll get started. I noticed that at JTS and the UJ, they do music during this time. And I guess that's, some people like it. It depends on whether you like the music or not. So we're not doing music. So no musical introduction today. And Suzanne is here. And Karen's joined us. I'm going to lose track of everybody now.
We'll wear name tags.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, so I guess I'll just get started now, and people who come late will catch up or watch the recording. So tonight is the last Talking to God session, and it's actually one of the only ones we're actually going to be talking about talking to God. The original plan I had for this series was I was going to talk about the prayer book and the prayers, but then I decided to use it as an opportunity to explore other faith traditions with some guest speakers, and other things came up. So the good news is that, I guess it's good news, if this is a subject you're interested in, Diane and I are going to be doing adult bar bat mitzvah program next year. And she's going to be teaching the Hebrew part of the prayers and the Torah readings to the students. And that will be from 9 to 10. And then from 10 to 11, about 10 sessions, not the whole year, but about 10 sessions, I'll spend talking more in detail about the prayer book. And I have certain structure already in mind for doing that, but I'm happy to entertain specific questions, or we can add sessions to look at prayers that aren't covered. So if you're interested in that subject, email me between now and September, and I'll add you to the list for the Adult B'nai Mitzvah email list. And you'll get a lot of emails that may or may not pertain to you, depending on whether you want to do the Adult Bar Bat Mitzvah. But I will definitely be able to send you the schedule of classes, and you'll see what dates I'm going to be talking about which prayers in more detail. So tonight, is that okay with everybody?
Yes.
Okay. So tonight, what I'm going to do is kind of like an overview, a little bit about Jewish prayer, and then specifically as it relates to the Amidah, because that's what I promised. We're going to be talking to God, and our private audience to God is specifically the Amidah. So I'm going to talk a little about how that works, and then discuss at the conclusion will be a few ideas about how to make it your personal audience with God, given that we have a fixed prayer book with fixed words on the page, written in Hebrew, a language we don't necessarily understand, poetic Hebrew at that, a language that's really, really hard to understand. And so we're going to try and understanding what it says. We'll do a little bit of that. I'll do more of that next year, and that will help us to make more sense out of what we're trying to get out of it. But even without that, we can talk about how to negotiate the prayer book from a modern perspective in our own personal lives, and hopefully have an audience with God.
Hello?
Everybody okay?
Yes.
Okay. So the first question is, why have a prayer book? I mean, if you want to have an audience with God, God's everywhere all the time. You could do it in your bedroom. Probably sometimes in your bedroom you don't want to do that. You could do it in your shower. You definitely don't want to do it there. You could do it when you're grocery shopping. Probably not a good idea either. You want to have an audience with God when you're able to focus your attention on it, on God, that is. So that's the first thing, but why have fixed prayers to do that? And the truth is, you don't need a fixed prayer book. You could do it at home, in your living room, the den, or whatever. Have a moment of solitude and meditate and transport yourself mentally, as you would imagine, into God's presence, however you understand that to be, and say whatever's on your mind. So you don't need a prayer book, and it doesn't need to be any particular time of day. It could be at 3 a.m. when you wake up and can't go back to bed, or, after you've had your cup of coffee in the morning. Whenever you feel like it, you can do that. But prayers have two parts. And one of them is what we call the kavanah, your intentional prayers, what's coming from your heart to God, and keva, a fixed order of the prayers. The fixed order of the prayers has a number of advantages. The first thing is there are times we want to come together to pray. First of all, Judaism is a communal religion. We get more power. I think most of us feel more power, more support, more focus when we're praying together as a community than when you're praying over a cup of coffee at breakfast. So coming together as a community to pray gives you more structure, more power, more focus, more attention, and more support. But if you're going to come together as a community, you want to be on the same page, literally. So that means you need to have a book with pages and words on the page so that we're not just all babbling our own things to each other in a room. That would be kind of annoying. So that's one reason for having fixed prayers. Another reason for having fixed prayers is that most of us are not wordsmiths. And most of us maybe haven't spent a lot of time thinking about God. So if we've got people like our sages who've thought a lot about God and thought about words to use to describe God, and they also happen to be wordsmiths like Shakespeare, why not use their words? It would sound much more elevated, and we'd know what we're supposed to say. We wouldn't be stumbling and fumbling for words, and we'd have some beautiful words and images to use. And so that's another reason for having fixed prayers. And of course, we also pray in Hebrew because that's the language of our people. This was actually one of the things that our movement separated from Reform Judaism over. The Reform Jews wanted to pray in the local language. Their idea, which was a very powerful idea, is if I'm going to talk to God, I should know what I'm saying. That's a really hard argument to get around. Good idea to know what you're saying if you're going to talk to God. So they said, well, let's pray in the local language. But our sense was, no, the tradition really is to pray in Hebrew. That way we're connecting ourselves to our ancestors for thousands of years. And it also connects us to Jews around the world. And so if we pray in Hebrew, you can go to Italy, France, Germany, or Israel. And if you open their prayer book, you can, and you know the structure of the prayers, you can kind of find yourself and you can at least know where you're looking at. It's not going to be Chinese and it'll sound like a foreign language and you don't understand where you are or what you're doing. So having Hebrew unites us with the Jewish people around the world and throughout time. Our solution to the problem of not knowing what you're praying is our prayer books have two sides, right? And on one side is Hebrew, the other side is English, all right, or whatever language you're in. So, so now you know what you're praying because you can look at the English. And by the way, you can pray in English if you feel like it when you're doing the silent Amidah. If it makes more meaning for you to do that for a while. And once you've got used to what the words are, you can flip over to the Hebrew and you'll know pretty much what you're saying in the Hebrew as well. So that's about that, Hebrew versus English. But I think we also need to understand that the language is poetic. Poetry is intentionally designed to be unpacked and to provide you with many different possible meanings of what's being said. And that helps you as a person pick and choose how you want to interpret those words. Sort of like when you go to an art exhibit and you're looking at a painting on the wall and somebody asks you, what do you think it means? And you say, well, I don't know. What did the artist mean? And then it turns out you're talking to the artist. And the artist says, well, I don't care what I thought it means. I want to know what you think it means. Because usually once a painter paints a beautiful picture, now it's to the public, and the public can interpret it however they want to interpret it. And so I think in some sense also these prayers were written with the opportunity for you to interpret them how it makes most meaningful sense to you. Same thing as when we study the Torah, the famous statement is Shivim Panim LaTorah. The Torah has 70 different faces. It can be turned this way and that way, and it can mean different things at different times. And it strikes us as having power and meaning differently each time we read it. The same thing with the prayer book and the words on the page. So remember that the prayers are metaphors. It's poetic language. I would not necessarily take the language literally. And the other thing I would say about it is my favorite metaphor is it's like a telescope. The prayers are trying to point us in a certain direction to understand God a certain way. You know, telescopes are designed so that you look through them, and it helps you to see something that you wouldn't be able to see with your naked eyes. And so these prayers are designed to help you see through the words to something that the poet is trying to direct your attention to, so that you can understand something better than you'd be able to understand on your own. The mistake that some people make is that instead of looking through the telescope, they look at the telescope. Right? They look at the words, the flat words on the page, and think they understand what's being said because they're taking it too literally. The poet meant for you to see past the words, to see something he's trying to point your mind at, to direct your mind, focus your mind at, that he couldn't otherwise say. And part of the reason for doing that, one more thing about this is, when we talk about God, God can't be seen. And none of our five senses really can be used to understand God, because God doesn't exist in space and time. And so our senses are used to pick up data about the physical world, and God doesn't exist in the physical world. So the language that we use is usually designed to try and describe things in the physical world. So we have to use poetic language to try and understand God and to try and explain God as we've perceived God to somebody else. Okay, so far, okay, everybody? One more analogy. It's another analogy I really like. And that is when Diane and I went to Italy, maybe you've heard this before, Diane and I went to Italy many, many years ago now. And we went to St. Peter's Cathedral, and we brought with us a guidebook. And I made Diane climb up all the stairs, all the way up to the top of the cupola in St. Peter's Cathedral. It's a lot of stairs to climb. She wasn't happy with me. But the guidebook said that there were some beautiful paintings by Michelangelo up in the inside of the dome. And I said, well, we've got to go see those. We got to go see those paintings. So we climbed all the way up inside the cupola to see Michelangelo's beautiful paintings. And there they were. Beautiful pictures. And of course, Michelangelo's painting scenes from the Bible. But if you come into St. Peter's Cathedral on the ground floor, you can see that there's a cupola up there, but you don't know that there's any paintings up there. So why was Michelangelo painting those paintings if everybody who came into the building had no idea what they were or what they looked like? Well, who was he painting for? So the guidebook said Michelangelo wasn't painting for the people in the pews. Michelangelo was painting for God. And he was taking God's words, the Bible, and converting them into his medium, paintings. And he was offering them back to God as a gift on behalf of the people who were praying in the pews. And the people knew that the greatest artist of their age, their generation, probably for many generations, had painted these beautiful paintings to God as an offering to God, like a sacrifice to God on their behalf. And that was enough for them, that they knew that Michelangelo had painted these paintings, even if they didn't get to see them. And the reason I talk about it is because some of these prayers are so intricate, so complex, so brilliant, that even Israelis who know Hebrew by heart may not understand fully what this poet was trying to say. But it's okay, because we know that some of the greatest Shakespeares in Jewish history wrote these beautiful works of art to be offered to God as a prayer. And so even if you don't fully understand it, don't feel bad. It's part of it is just is the idea that this is a gift that was created by our Jewish Shakespeares as a way to communicate with God. So that's enough about that. Any questions so far? Okay, so let me talk about the Amidah particularly. So the Amidah is the centerpiece of the prayer service. And it was specifically designed to replace the sacrifices in the temple. We have lots and lots of other prayers in the prayer book. They all have their own purposes. We'll talk about them in September through May. Just right now, I want to talk about the Amidah. And the purpose of the Amidah was to replace the sacrifices that were offered in the temple. Two main kinds of sacrifices were offered: personal sacrifices and community sacrifices. So the first thing, when the temple gates are opened, the priests come in and they offer a sacrifice to God on behalf of the entire Israelite people all over the world. That sacrifice is the Shacharit sacrifice, the one in the morning sacrifice. In the afternoon, they offered a second sacrifice on behalf of all the Israelites all over the world. That's another communal sacrifice. And in between those, and after the afternoon sacrifice, there's a whole stream of individuals coming to the temple to offer their personal sacrifices, either to give thanks to God, or to ask God for something, or to ask God's forgiveness, or to try and straighten the relationship out with God, what they used to call guilt offerings or sin offerings. I like to think of it as trying to make up with God. So you had these different kinds of sacrifices, personal sacrifices. Each individual would come in, they'd buy a chicken, they'd buy a cow, they'd buy a goat, and they bring it to the priest. The priest would slaughter it and roast it, and either the priest ate it or he ate some of it and he gave it back to the worshiper to eat the rest of it. And you would be in God's presence, celebrating in God's presence. The Amidah replaces both kinds of sacrifices. At least this is my interpretation. And that's the reason why we have an individual sacrifice, individual Amidah, the personal silent Amidah that each person recites. And then the prayer leader, if you're in a community, if you have a minyan, the person who's leading the prayer service goes back and repeats it all over again. It's only repeated if you're in a community. And the only way that makes sense to me is that that's replacing the community sacrifice, right? So that replaces the Shacharit if you're doing the morning service, or the Mincha if you're doing the afternoon service. It replaces those sacrifices from the morning and the afternoon. We added an extra Amidah in the evening. Probably originally, well, we know that originally it was optional. It's not optional anymore. We don't get out of doing an Amidah in the evening, but originally it was optional. And I think the reason for that was because we were getting together in the evening anyway to do the Shema and its blessings, which is another unit of prayer. And it just didn't seem right to get together to do the Shema if you're not going to do an Amidah. The Amidah was like that basic building block of Jewish prayer. Of course, we're going to do an Amidah. But we don't repeat the evening Amidah because there was no communal offering in the evening. So it's only a private prayer to God. And of course, on Shabbat and festivals, we have the Musaf service. Musaf means extra, and it's the extra one because on Shabbat and festivals, an extra sacrifice was brought. So we're going to do an extra Amidah. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, now we're going to talk about what are we doing with the Amidah? So let me see if I can share a screen here. Where's my share screen? There's share screen. Okay. Boom. Okay. So it replaces the sacrifices. The evening was added later. So it's our private audience before God. This is on C over here. And it includes a lot of stuff that we may not necessarily want to say when we have a private audience to God. So think of it more like a laundry list or a shopping list. It's a list of things that you might want to say, and you can focus on the ones that are meaningful to you right now and kind of either skip over or race through the ones that are not meaningful. I know that sounds heretical, and you say, wow, the rabbi told me to skip some prayers in the prayer book. Not just me. Actually, Abraham Joshua Heschel said that. So I'm just quoting a great scholar. And he said, look, if this is not meaningful, you just skip that part and hang out on the part that's meaningful to you, and you'll catch up with everybody else later. So that's the first thing of kind of already a bit of a strategy there for dealing with prayer, is focus on the parts that are meaningful to you right now. So this is your private audience before God, and that is why there's a special choreography for doing the Amidah, what I call, now that I live in Texas, the Texas three-step. Not a Texas two-step, but a three-step. Because you take 3 steps forward to enter God's presence. The problem with taking 3 steps forward is most of us now sit in pews. So if you take 3 steps forward, you'll fall over the pew in front of you, onto the person in front of you. Bad idea. So that's why we take 3 little steps back till we hit the seat behind us, and then take 3 little steps forward until we're as far forward as we can go, and that's our approaching into God. It's really only symbolic anyway. The point of it, right, God is everywhere. The point of it is to get our heads into the headspace of saying, we are now entering into God's presence. So that's the purpose of the Texas three-step. It's your moment to imagine as if, and of course, these ideas were developed when there were kings. So I'm going to use the analogy of a king because that's what our ancestors had in mind, but we can update it to today, right? You're coming into the White House or whatever you think. So you're coming into the presence of this great audience hall. And that's how you're going to focus your mind on being in God's presence and having this audience, literally an audience with God. Now, I sometimes analogize it to Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. So when Dorothy comes to visit the Wizard of Oz, right? I remember when I was a kid and I first saw the movie, right? She comes into the great, powerful, awesome Wizard of Oz's audience room, and it's terrifying, and she's terrified. Oh my God, this big head is, shouting at me with this echo and whatever. And so she is in this big audience room with Oz. That's kind of the experience people had when they came into the presence of the king. It might be something like seeing the president, although hopefully we're not terrified of the president, but King certainly conveyed that sort of, awesome fearfulness, right? So she's coming into the presence of the Wizard of Oz. So you're walking into this presence. By the way, of course, one big difference is there isn't a man behind the curtain, or at least we can't really see the person behind the curtain, right? We have to imagine what that being is like. But in any case, she comes in, she is not coming alone, right? She brought with her the Tin Man who doesn't have a heart, the Scarecrow that doesn't have a brain, and the lion that's cowardly, and Toto. And so she's got friends with her, which give her some moral support. So again, if you're praying in a community, that's part of your moral support. But just in case that's not enough moral support, the opening blessing we recite when we take the 3 steps back and the 3 steps forward, I forgot one other thing. The first thing we have to do is bow before the king. And so on the opening blessing, the Avot, it's Baruch Atah Adonai. We bend our knees. This was sort of the formal way to bow before a king. You bend your knees on Baruch, you bow on Atah, and then you stand up for Adonai, which is God's name, right? Because we want to be at attention when we're pronouncing God's name. So Baruch Atah Adonai, right? So we bow before God, and then right away we introduce ourselves. You know, you are the God of our ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So here we're bringing in with us into God's courtroom our ancestors, right? Sometimes people say, who am I to talk to God? I'm just a puny human being. My life is very short on a little planet out in the outer reaches of the spiral galaxy or whatever it's called. You know, so who am I to talk to God, the creator of the universe? And so part of what we say when we introduce God is, you know what, God, I'm not coming just by myself as a puny little human being. I'm coming from a tradition that's trying to understand you for 4,000 years, that have had scholars and spiritual people and wise people who have given us a pathway to understanding you for 4,000 years. That's who I'm coming to you with. And the expression that's used there is Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, right? The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And our the people who wrote these prayers composed them not out of thin air, but often took snippets of Bible and rabbinic commentaries and pasted them together to make a picture, right? So this expression, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, comes from Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, when Moses first encounters God at the burning bush. Since it's a biblical quote, Rashi, the famous French Bible scholar, asked the question, why did God's announcing himself to Moses, I am the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Why did God have to say to Moses, repeat the word God all the time? Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. Why didn't he just say Elohei Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov? Right? It's extra words. God didn't need to say extra words. And the answer is because God had a different relationship with each of our ancestors. Right? So imagine Abraham, the trials of Abraham. Abraham leaves home because God asks him to, goes to a place he doesn't know. He may be afraid. He's by himself. He's in a new place. He argues with God about Sodom and Gomorrah. He follows God's orders to almost sacrifice his son. All these different aspects of Abraham's relationship with God are kind of wrapped up in that one expression, Elohei Abraham. Isaac, on the other hand, was almost sacrificed, right? And if you understand the tradition, he was like 36 years old. So he was willing to sacrifice himself for faith in God. So that's part of his relationship with God. He falls in love with his wife, Rebecca, and so on. Whatever those elements are of Isaac's life, that's all wrapped up in Elohei Yitzchak. Jacob starts out a trickster, right? Tricks his brother out of the birthright for a pot of lentil stew. Then he has to run away from home and he's afraid. And he goes to sleep and he imagines the stairway to heaven. And then he goes to the home of his ancestors and falls in love with Rachel, and he works for 20 years for his uncle, and he ends up, all the different things about Jacob. And then he has to come back home and confront his brother again, and he wrestles with an angel. All of those things are wrapped up in the expression Elohei Yaakov. So if you wanted to spend your whole Amidah time, you could spend your whole Amidah time just thinking about this one phrase. Right? Everybody else is doing the whole Amidah, and you're just thinking about the different relationships our ancestors had with God and what that might mean to you. By the way, our movement now adds the mothers, right? So it's Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And what was their relationship with God like? And how does that affect me? So that's just like one way to unpack the metaphor of that one small little phrase. But then, since this is what God said to Moses at the burning bush, you could also say, well, this also means it's the God of Moses. And what was his relationship to God? There's like 4 books about his relationship to God. And also the idea that when Moses has that encounter with God at the burning bush, the first thing that God tells him is take your shoes off because you're standing on holy ground. And here you are in God's presence. We don't take our shoes off, but it reminds us that we're standing on holy ground as we encounter God. And then another aspect of this is that God revealed a message to Moses at the burning bush, right? To go rescue the Israelites. And so as we have our private audience with God and we want to express certain things from our heart, we can also be open to what God may want to express to us as if we're at our own burning bush. So all of those things, again, can be wrapped up in just that one little phrase. And then there's the expression Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vahanara, the great, mighty, and awesome, which sounds a little bit like the Wizard of Oz, right? The great, mighty, awesome wizard. But actually, this comes from Deuteronomy 10:17. And you can read in context sometime there, I mean, what the context of that is, and it can give you some added meaning about what great, mighty, and awesome is. For right now, I just want to say that we don't add extra adjectives. The rabbis, when they composed this prayer, said, you know, if you want to add extra adjectives for God, there's no end to adjectives you can add. You can say the super duper, the exciting, the thrilling, the interesting, the powerful, the whatever, great, magnificent, whatever. You can come up with tons of adjectives and you'll never stop with the adjectives. So they said, look, Moses said these are 3 things: great, mighty, awesome. Just stick with those 3 and that's it. So the great, mighty, awesome God. And then El Elyon, the God Most High, is what Melchizedek, the King Melchizedek, said to Abraham after the victory of the 4 kings and the 5 kings. If you know what that's about, it's from Genesis 14:19. Melchizedek greets Abraham and gives him a blessing in the name of the God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. We don't use that Konei Shamayim Va'aretz in the weekday Amidah. Does anybody remember where we do say Konei Shamayim Va'aretz? So in the Friday night service, this is kind of an interesting thing. I told you there's no repetition of the Amidah in the evening, but there's a sort of a quasi-repetition of the Amidah in the Friday night service. I don't have time to show that to you, but when you go to the Friday night service next time, there's one paragraph. It's only one paragraph, but if you look closely, it includes all the words of the different blessings. It includes hinting words to each of the blessings of the Amidah. And in the beginning, it says, Konei Shamayim Va'aretz. El Elyon Konei Shamayim Va'aretz. The God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. The full quote from Melchizedek. And then it goes on to talk about how God is, revives the dead and is holy and sanctifies the Sabbath and so on. So all of those elements are in that one paragraph after the Amidah and the Friday night service. Anyway, the first blessing concludes with Shield of Abraham, Magen Avraham, and that is a quote from Genesis chapter 15:1, where God says to Abraham, I will be a shield for you. Now, we added the Imahot, and we wanted to include Sarah and highlight Sarah the way the prayer highlights Abraham. And so we had to find a verb for Sarah. And there's no comparable phrase to Elohei Abraham, Elohei Isaac, Elohei Yaakov. Nothing in the Torah says Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah. We kind of made that up, and that's why some people don't like saying that, because we added that. And then we had to come up with a verb for the conclusion, Magen Avraham, and we came up with Poked Sarah, which means remembered Sarah. When did God remember Sarah? When she was old, and God came to Abraham and said, "You're going to have another son, and it'll be Isaac." He remembered Sarah, remembered her prayer for a child, and they had a child. So Poked Sarah seemed appropriate to be sort of parallel to Magen Abraham. Okay, so that's kind of the opening blessing. Questions? Yes, Lou.
So the Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, I understand that each of the patriarchs had a different relationship with
Yes.
God. However, couldn't you look at it and say, does that mean that God is not echad? God is not one.
Right. So so here's my analogy here is to Martin Buber. It's a modern Jewish philosopher who's Martin Buber. His famous book was I and Thou. And like the central thesis of the book, as I recall from when I took the class in college, was that the ideas about relationships, and a lot's been written since he had this idea in psychology and philosophy and so on about, human identity is very much wrapped up in our relationships with other people. And the idea that Buber had was that we need to see each person that we're talking to or communicating with or have a relationship with as a separate, full human being, right? Not not an object that we can manipulate or use to our advantage or somehow, try to obtain some kind of benefit for or abuse or, God forbid, or some other kind of thing. Each person is an independent, full human being that has their own dignity and respect and right to their worldview. And when you communicate with that person, you have a special relationship with them. So I have a brother, Henry, and our relationship, when I think of Henry, I think of him as my brother Henry, and that sort of defines Henry for me. But he's married to a woman named Suzanne. And so Suzanne's relationship to Henry is as her husband, Henry, and that's almost like a different person. The way she understands Henry is different from how I understand Henry, right? And that's kind of the way Buber would say we look at God. Each of us has a different perspective about God. And it's the same God, but the relationship defines in a sense how we understand God. And so it's different. It's just different. That makes sense? God's only still one, but we're all different people and we have different capacities to try and understand God. God's a pretty hard concept to get, right? Because he doesn't exist in a physical world. And so it's a hard concept to get, and we're all going to come up with different ways of understanding that. And that's the best we can do. And that's our understanding of God. We're still looking at the same thing or same being, but necessarily it's different and described different, and relationship is different. Any other questions so far? So I hope I'm not, so everybody's okay so far? It was good? Okay. So the second blessing, I think I'll just do the second one and then we'll look at the ending. So the second blessing is Givurot. So now that we've introduced ourselves and we said we're here with the long tradition of people who've understood you, and we have our own personal relationship with you as well, right? That's part of the avot thing, right? If Abraham had his relationship, I'm coming to you as me. Yeah, I have this history behind me, but I'm a different person myself, right? Okay. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, again, you're presenting yourself to the king. Wow, you are really powerful. How powerful are you? The ultimate power is life over death. And that's the second blessing. It's called Givurot, which means powers. And it emphasizes, though, God's power of life over death, and repeats Mechaye Metim over and over and over again. Why is that there? Because there was a dispute between the Sadducees and the Pharisees about resurrection. The Pharisees believed in resurrection, the Sadducees did not. Pharisees believed in life after death, the Sadducees did not. And the Pharisees are the ones who wrote the book. So they wanted to impress on us, yes, we believe in life after death, that God has the power of life over death, and so that's why it's repeated several times. Perhaps that would mean that the Sadducees would not want to pray that prayer. As I mentioned here, the concept's not really found in the Torah. That's a whole nother story. But that's what the Pharisees believed. It certainly was a powerful belief during Second Temple times. As I mentioned here, perhaps as a result of the Maccabean persecution by the Greeks, a lot of brave and pious people died. And the idea was, well, they couldn't have died in vain. There must be some kind of reward for them in an afterlife, perhaps a bodily resurrection. In any case, that's what the Pharisees believed. So what do we do as modern people? Again, now we're modern people now. We're going to interpret these metaphors symbolically to fit how we understand the world. So if you believe in resurrection of the dead, which is specifically that your body will be restored at some future time, your soul will be put back in your body and you'll live in a perfect world with the Messiah. If you believe that, that's the traditional belief, and that's great. No, you don't have any problem with the second blessing. If you're like me, I'm not so sure about that. I do believe in a spiritual afterlife, though. So when I read Mechaye Metim, gives life to the dead, I'm thinking about a spiritual afterlife, right? And that's what I think about. But you can also see it in other ways. Perhaps it's immortality through your offspring, or through the deeds we have done that will somehow live on in the people who follow us, the creations of our mind and our spirits, the inspirations we've given to others. In all these different ways, we will continue to live beyond our lifetimes. It could also refer to the daily renewal of life, like when you come back to life, sort of when you sleep at night, right? You bring life to the sleeping, sort of lifeless body, or the way the cycle of nature, where there's a renewal in springtime. However you want to understand it, there's different ways you can do that. Of course, the Reform movement, as you probably know, changed the words. They were not comfortable with Mechaye Metim, so they just said Mechaye Hakol, that God gives life to everything. Our movement has, although we changed the first blessing to add the matriarchs, we try not to change things if we don't have to. And so I would much rather reinterpret Mechaye Metim than change the words to Mechaye Hakol. If you're praying silently, of course, you can do it any way you like. But the prayer leader, again, then it's a community standard, so it depends on what synagogue you're in. Reuven Hammer, who wrote a nice book about Jewish prayer called Entering Jewish Prayer, had this interpretation of it. He said, maybe we don't exactly know what this should mean, how we should understand it. It's a complex universe. It's just a symbol. Words convey a direction of thought, not a definition. God's power extends beyond the realm of life and death. As he put it, the meaning and significance of human life extends beyond the realm of the earth and this universe. Okay, so let me go back to, we have some questions here. Oh, Lou.
Yeah. So with regard to resurrection, if it's not a concept from Torah, it's certainly a concept from Ezekiel. And was there a concept of resurrection before Ezekiel, who was really before the Second Temple?
Okay, so Ezekiel, in my opinion, I mean, I guess there's some debate among Bible scholars, but I think the majority of modern Bible scholars would say Ezekiel really didn't have in mind resurrection of the dead. So to understand Ezekiel, you have to understand the biblical mind and particularly the prophetic mind. So what Lou is referring to, for those who may not know, is Ezekiel has this vision of a valley of dry bones. And God tells him to prophesy over the dry bones and tell them to live again. And sure enough, all the bones kind of rattle together and form skeletons, and the skeletons grow flesh and skin and then are clothed. And all of a sudden there's a whole array of living beings in this valley, right? The valley of the dry bones. So the valley is now filled with human beings again, living human beings. But you have to remember that prophets always had visions, and the visions were not necessarily reality. You know, they were more vision. They're called visions. The Hebrew language didn't have, I don't think, the way to specify this is all in your head. You know, it's what you're imagining. You're imagining this. It's right. And so when they said God showed me something, it's like God showed me in my head. I had an image in my head of what God was trying to show me. So my interpretation of the Valley of the Dry Bones is simply this. There was a valley of dry bones. Usually these images are based on something that they really saw. So he actually saw a valley of dry bones, probably from a battle that was fought in the valley, and then nobody bothered to bury the dead people who died in the battle. So they're all strewn bones all over the valley floor. That's what he sees, but then he imagines them coming back to life. And in any case, God then tells him, it's not about these bones coming back to life. It's about the Israelite community coming back to life in their homeland. And that's what he's supposed to convey to the Jews in diaspora in Babylonia. You feel like you are desiccated dry bones, dead on the ground. That this is the end of the Jewish people forever because you've been taken into captivity. And like the Northern Kingdom, you're going to assimilate into the society there and will never hear from us again. That's wrong. God is telling you that you will be reconstituted in your homeland and you'll be a living, thriving people again in your homeland. Just hang on for a while. And that prophecy comes true. I mean, that's one of the most astonishing things in our history. Well, we have a lot of astonishing things in our history, but that is pretty astonishing. Within 30, 40 years of his prophecy, the Persian Empire conquers the Babylonian Empire, and Cyrus says, go home and rebuild your temple. I mean, nobody would have guessed that in Ezekiel's day. But that was the message he was supposed to convey, and it came true. So I don't think that was a literal thing about there's going to be resurrection of the dead. That was a typical image, sort of something that the prophet envisioned in their mind. And then the interpretation of that vision is what's important. There are in Daniel, in the book of Daniel, which is Second Temple times, there seems to be a more direct reference to resurrection of the dead, and possibly Second Isaiah. I think somebody said there might be a reference to resurrection of the dead, but wasn't certainly a widespread belief until Second Temple times. Okay, let's go to the end. And then I want some practical ideas. So the end, let me stop the sharing here for a second. So the end of the Amidah is that, so you're having a private audience with God, and you can't just turn around and walk out on God. You don't turn around on the priest, on the king, or turn your back to the king, say, see you later. That's not how you leave the king's throne room. So at the end, first of all, we do Modim Anachnu Lach, where we're going to thank God for the miracles that are with us every day, not necessarily for fulfilling our personal wishes, but for the idea that we can breathe, that our lungs work, our blood circulates, there's air to breathe, there's friends in our life, there's food on the table. The world is so magnificent. So the miracles that are with us every single minute, right? That's what Modim Anachnu Lach is. And so we're going to thank God. And when you say thank you, you bow. Thank you, God. Now, it's not the formal entrance into the king's throne room. So you don't bend your knees. You're just bowing. At the end of Modim, you do bend your knees because we're going to do Baruch Atah Adonai, right? And so at the end, you bend your knees on Baruch again. And then you stand up as you do the concluding blessing for the thank you prayer for Modim. One way to remember when you're supposed to bend is that the word Baruch is related to the Hebrew word berech, which means knee. And so whenever you're going to say, not whenever, but the few times we bow, it happens that we do it on the word Baruch. So you're going to bend your knee on Baruch, and then Atah, and then stand up on Adonai. Now we only bow at the beginning and at the end. And again, there's a bunch of blessings in between. There's a lot of Baruchs in between. No bowing. The reason for that is, well, the analogy I give is it's from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Hope anybody see Monty Python and the Holy Grail? No. Anyway, watch it. It's kind of a fun movie. Maybe it's a little dated now. Anyway, so Monty Python's a dated British comedy troupe. And of course, the Holy Grail, it's about King Arthur and his knights in search of the Holy Grail. And toward the beginning of the movie, a cartoon god appears in a cloud and talks to King Arthur and his men and gives them the charge to look for the Holy Grail. So Arthur, and all the knights are like, oh, we're not worthy. And they're groveling on the ground. Oh my God, God's in front of us. We're not worthy. Help us. And the cartoon god says, stop that groveling. I can't stand all that groveling. And that's the reason why we don't bow in between. The rabbis were a little more dignified about it. They said, you bow at the beginning when you introduce yourself. You bow when you're taking leave of the king. But God doesn't want us groveling all the time. He gave us 2 legs to stand upright. You should stand in a dignified manner before the king. But you do formally bow at the beginning, you formally bow at the end, and the rest of the time you should remain standing. So then we bow at the end with Modim, and then we do Sim Shalom or Shalom Rav, depending on prayer for peace. And then as we take leave of God, instead of turning around and showing our back to God, remember we took 3 steps forward. Now we're going to take 3 steps back. And that's the way you left the presence of a king. Sometimes you see this in old movies when they visit, you go to the king for an audience. You take leave of the king by bowing and backing up, facing the king. And that's the way we do it. We take 3 steps back. And again, we're going to bow 3 times to the left, to the right, and to the center. That's a very formal way of bowing as you leave. Sometimes you might see that also in these old movies. So why to the left and then the right? So there, obviously, we're Jews. There was an argument. Do you do the left first or the right first? Of course, we have to argue about everything. It was, I'm a left-handed person, but it's a right-handed world. And so the tendency would be to say, well, I'm going to bow to the right first because that's the most dignified hand, quote unquote. I'm offended, but whatever. The most dignified right, we're going to bow to the right first. But then the question was, well, is it my right or God's right? And the answer is, of course, you bow to God's right first. So that's our left. So now we're bowing to the left first, and then the right, and then the center as we take leave of God's presence. And then once you've taken your 3 steps back, you're out of the courtroom and you don't have to be at attention anymore. Now, there's much more to the Amidah, but again, we can talk about that in September. Just want to conclude with a few suggestions. So let me see about this one over here. So let's go to the end over here. So practical praying. So first thing is that realize that every time you pray doesn't have to be a spiritual high, right? The idea is to focus on the fact that you are in God's presence and you're trying to communicate something and maybe even get some inspiration from God. But, it's not going to work every time, right? Sometimes they're better than others, like with exercise. But if you don't set aside fixed times to pray, it's likely you won't pray at all and you'll get out of shape. And that's another reason for praying in a community, because, there's people relying on you. It's like going to the gym with a partner. Like Diane and I are hopefully going to start doing that. She keeps trying to get me to go, but hopefully it'll work. Right? If you have a partner that you go with and you feel responsible, you're more likely to go. If you're by yourself, you'll sleep an extra hour, right? So knowing that you have to be at the minyan, that keeps you going on a regular basis, keeps you in shape. And not every time will it be wonderful, but you are more likely to have more spiritually uplifting moments if you do it on a regular basis. Like I said, you can use the English to understand the prayer better, and don't be frustrated by the translation. Think of it like a challenge of interpreting poetry. Focus on the main themes of the prayers instead of the details. There is a lot of poetry and beauty in how these things were so carefully crafted, but even like I said, Israelis don't necessarily know what those details are. The main thing is the themes of the prayers. And so focus on the themes of the prayers and then what those themes mean to you instead of necessarily the particular words. It's very important that even though we all have fixed prayers in the prayer book, that we add our own thoughts to the prayers. What are you feeling right now? What's on your mind? What anxieties, fears, or frustrations you have? What are you grateful for right now? What's giving you pleasure and comfort in your life right now? And then I'm married to a cantor. And I've, over the years, definitely come to see that the music is a powerful spiritual aspect of prayer, right? If somebody really has a good melody and a beautiful voice, that really moves us. And so that's important. And let the music move you, even if the words, that aren't, sometimes the music conveys a more power than the words themselves, and that's okay. I assume that these prayers were chanted from the time they were written, and the music was just as important then as it is today, even if we're doing different music now. And then but the last is keep the goal in mind, to come closer to your Creator, to come closer to your family, friends, and community, and to become a responsible member of the Jewish community. Okay, so any last questions about that? Oh, okay. No other questions? So again, I'll be teaching probably about 10 sessions on Jewish prayers starting in the fall. If you're interested in that, it'll be 10 to 11. And if you email me, when I get the schedule put together, I will send it to you. And you can come to as many or as few as you want. And we'll cover more prayers. And then if you want to add other prayers that aren't on the list, I'll add some sessions to it because, we have more than 10 weeks. Okay. All right. Thank you all. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Very interesting
Thanks.
way of looking at it. I will be looking at the Amidah a little bit differently this weekend, perhaps.
Okay. Good.
Rabbi, what time? You said you're going to do it from 10 to 11. What day?
It'll be Sundays, starting probably in October
Sunday.
after the holidays.
Oh, that's great. Good time. Thank you so much.
Okay. Sure.
Okay. Good night, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.